Um, he probably heard other voices. Why did he believe this one? There must have been an a priori sort of functional necessity for him to believe the voice that told him one thing or another. And I think that's a string that runs through the Bible and then through the New Testament. We are expected as, well, I confess I'm a Christian. I act like I believe God is real. And so there is this a call of faith. And also in every hero story we see now, there is always a moment in that story where the hero must believe something beyond the evidence that is before them, which is to say they must take a leap of faith. So I'm wondering if you could just kind of unpack that experience of faith and the understanding of how a human being makes the choice to believe one thing or another.
God, that's a great question. I mean, is this still on? Is this still working? Okay, good. I don't precisely know the answer to that. It's a very peculiar thing because we think many things, or you could say many voices appear in our minds. Because when Nietzsche took Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" apart, and he said, well, it isn't so obvious that there's an I, first of all, that it's a unity, like a unity transparent unto itself, which of course the psychoanalysts picked up in a big way. And then he wasn't sure that it was the I who thought in some causal manner. He said, well, no, it's more like thoughts, it's something like thoughts appear in the phenomenal field, and maybe you choose between them, or maybe they possess you. Like there's lots of other ways of thinking about it. It isn't exactly obvious to me why we choose to take one pathway rather than another, when so many of them offer themselves to us, you know. People tend to talk about that as something like conscience, right? And now, maybe it's that it's got to have something to do, I think. It's an endless regress, because you can always ask why any assumption became primary. But I'll put that aside for a moment. It seems to me to have something to do with your aims. You know, that you're more likely to listen to a voice that is in keeping with your most fundamental aims. And then the question is, where do your most fundamental aims come from? And from what I've been able to determine, and I'll speak psychologically again, is that to begin with, you're a concatenation of rather primitive subpersonalities. Hungry ones, tired ones, upset ones, laughing ones. You can see that in babies. You know, they cycle through those states very rapidly. There's a infantile unity above all that, but it doesn't have control, right? And so then the developing individual has to figure out how to integrate those primitive subpersonalities into a unified personality. At the same time, they integrate the unified personality into a social unity. So it's partly individual integration, but it's fed by social forces. I mean, even when you watch an infant breastfeed, it's established a relationship with its mother, and there's a reciprocity that's already at play there. So then that underlying multiplicity starts to form itself into a unity. And then the question, and I would say that's something like the emergence of the individual out of the Titans. That's a reasonable way of thinking about it. Like a sovereign out of the Titans. It's something like that. But then there's another division which seems to me to parallel the Cain and Abel division. It's that integration can be oriented towards something that's positive, but it can also be oriented towards something that's negative. And that's the split of the world into good and evil, I think. And then it looks like you're navigating between those. And I can only account for that with something like choice. Like, I think the free choice, even though I don't understand it, I'm unwilling to deny the existence of free choice merely because I don't understand it. Because it looks to me like that's how people act, that's how they expect to be treated, and that societies that structure themselves in accordance with the idea that people have free choice actually work. Now, that doesn't prove that there's free choice, but people have been arguing about that forever. But it looks to me, so those are two possible means of integration, and then I think what you're doing is feeding one or the other constantly. And I think you probably choose which one to feed. I think. That's how it feels that way to me as well. Like when I look at my own, maybe you're really aggravated with something. Maybe you're aggravated with your wife, or your child or something like that, and you're feeling kind of nasty, and maybe you even know that you're in the wrong. And an idea comes into your head. You think, I could say that. And you could say it, and you know what it would do. But then you pause and you think, would that make it better or worse? And then maybe you go to hell with it, which is quite the thing to say. I've got a little story about that in a minute. And then you say it, but you knew that you took the low road, right? And you know it. And then you're guilty about that and defensive, and that makes the fight way worse, because then there's no damn way you're going to admit that you actually did that. And so things do go to hell. And so here's an ugly little idea. So that's relevant to the question. So imagine you're playing around with cocaine. Now, I'm using cocaine because it's very addictive, but it's a very interesting chemical because it's a dopaminergic agonist. And what dopamine does is two things. It makes you feel like what you're doing is worthwhile, but it also, imagine that there's a bunch of neural circuits that are active, and then they get a hit of dopamine, or you do. Then those neural circuits get a little bit more powerful. Okay, so it has a rewarding property, which is that it makes you feel like what you're doing is important, and it has a reinforcing property, which is it makes neural circuits grow. So now what that means is that whatever you were doing just before you took cocaine grows. Okay, so now imagine there's a bunch of different things that you do just before you take cocaine, but there's a string of decisions, and at one decision point is the same for all of those different occurrences. And that decision point is, because you're in trouble, and that decision point is, well, to hell with it. Okay, so then you think that each of the 200 times that you take cocaine, even though you do it in different places, but that one thought is there all the time, and that thing grows because you're reinforcing it, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And so now that's in you, that's part of you, and it's the thing that says to hell with it. Okay, so now, and maybe that's not such a good thing to grow inside your brain. So then you're addicted, and they take you to a cocaine treatment center, and after a week you're no longer physiologically addicted. You're not craving, you don't have a problem, as long as you're there. But then they take you back to your normal environment, and you see, like, Cocaine Joe, your friend, and as soon as you see him, up that thing comes, and bang, you're back on the to hell with it track. And that's where you will end up too, if you reinforce that particular perspective long enough. So that's akin in a sense to this decision-making process. If you take the low road, then that wins, and it gets a little stronger. Because everything that wins neurologically gets a little stronger. It's like a Darwinian competition. So one rule is don't practice what you don't want to become, because you really do become that. It builds itself right into your neural architecture. And that's one of the terrifying things about addiction, because you think, well, it's kind of psychological. It's like, yeah, kind of. It's also kind of neurophysiological, and you build a one-eyed cocaine monster in your head if you hit yourself enough with something that reinforcing. So